Hello, Houston. Every now and then, well, not every now and then, so far, we have been kind of looking at the parts. Now we're going to start putting it all together. So we're going to start looking at language itself. And we're going to start today with looking at abstract reasoning, one of the elements that feeds into the use of language. In fact, everything in language can be represented by a symbol. In fact, it's the symbols that constitute the language itself. For most of us, it's a discovery that's made very early in life, so early, in fact, that we can't even intellectually appreciate the idea that symbols relate to the world that we are a part of. But this ability turns out to be incredibly important to our ability to manipulate symbols and to know what's going on in our conversations. Basically, consider this example from Helen Keller's life story. Helen Adams Keller was born on June 27th of 1880 in Tuscumbia, which is in northwest Alabama. Helen's mother soon noticed that her daughter was failing to respond when the dinner bell rang after she took over an illness, was fevered in February of 1882. At the time, they said they thought it was brain fever. Modern day doctors would probably refer to it as either scarlet fever or meningitis. But in any case, the net result was it wasn't treated properly. And by the time Helen's mother began to notice abnormalities in Helen's behavior, she was not responding visually or orally, that is by ear, or by mouth. She wouldn't talk. And the illness had left her both blind and deaf, and as it turned out, because she wasn't being educated, she wasn't responsive to what was being said to her. In fact, she also was not speaking properly. So the family consulted Alexander Graham Bell. You might as well go to the top when you've got a problem. So they called him. And in fact, he eventually put them in touch with a gentleman by the name of Michael Anagnos. I don't know if I'm spelling it correctly, Anagnos. You figure it out. But in any case, he was the director of the Perkins Institute and also the Massachusetts Asylum for the Blind. And after meeting with Helen, Michael recommended a former pupil of the institution of which he was director, a lady by the name of Anne Sullivan, whose image we'll put on the screen here for you now, and let you look at specifically what she looks like. That's Anne Sullivan. Consider these passages that describe the moment at which Ms. Keller realized that all things have names, because she is one of the few people in the world where people were actually there when that event took place, and it was so obvious how it had happened that Anne Sullivan comments on it in the book that she wrote. What's described is a moment on the estate on Long Island where they both lived. And Anne Sullivan was down at the well, having taken Helen along with her to draw water from the well. And as Sullivan describes it, the word coming so close upon the sensation of cold water rushing over her hand seemed to startle her. She dropped the mug and stood as one transfixed. A new light came into her face. She spelled water several times. Then she dropped to the ground and asked for its name and pointed to the pump and the trellis. And suddenly, turning round, she asked for my name. I spelled teacher. Just then, the nurse brought Helen's little sister into the pump house, and Helen spelled baby and pointed to the nurse. All the way back to the house, she was highly excited and learned the name of every object she touched, so that in a few hours, she added 30 new words to her vocabulary. That's in a book by Sullivan in 1903. And the dramatic moment that's being described there is the exact moment in the life of Helen Keller when she made the link so many of us make so easily. That is the link between a language system and that to which it refers. Perhaps even more dramatic is the description of the event from Keller's own perspective as depicted in her book, Story of My Life. And so with Helen Keller, as Miss Keller described it, it's as follows. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other hand the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, joy, set it free. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. I learned a great many new words that day, words that were to make the world blossom for me, written in Keller's book in 1902. And basically what she's referring to there, of course, is language. We're going to define it simply as a collection of symbols and rules for combining symbols, allowing us to communicate an infinite variety of messages. And there are really two fundamental aspects of language that we'll be looking at. One is verbal comprehension, okay? And we'll define that simply as the ability to correctly interpret or decode written and spoken linguistic input. And that will be our subject in this and also some part of the next lecture. The other element of it is essentially verbal fluency. That is the ability to produce, express, or encode such linguistic output. It involves transforming our thoughts into a form that can be expressed as linguistic output, whether that be speaking, signing, or writing. Some would argue even that it might include artistic offerings in addition. This will be our subject in the next pair of lectures. Then we'll have our second review and exam in the course after lectures 17 and 18. So using language, we can communicate with others. We can think about our world in terms of what we see, what we hear, smell, taste, touch, and we can do so either in concrete or in abstract form. So holding Helen's hand under a spigot while simultaneously shaping Helen's hand into the form of successive letters awakened in Helen a newfound awareness of her world, a newfound means of thinking about her world, and a newfound means of communicating about that world, as she expressed. It is to this concept, language, to which we address ourselves both in this and the next lecture. Three techniques of study have been facilitated, or I should say have facilitated, our understanding of language. One of them is linguistics, which is basically the study of language structure and change. The second is neurolinguistics, the relationship between the brain and language, and you'll notice the nature of cognitive psychology has been moving increasingly toward also appreciating the brain-based location of the various sites where language-related processes go on. And then thirdly, sociolinguistics, which is essentially the relationship between social behavior and language. These distinctions were developed by Carroll about 20 years ago. And today what we're going to focus on, there are two things we're going to be looking at. One is we're going to look at distinctive properties of language, and I'm going to list actually 5 or 6 of them by the time we get done, and about 2/3 of the lecture will be spent doing that. One of the features of language is simply that it is communicative. Language enables us to communicate with anyone who shares that language. Although this is an obvious feature, it is one, the magnitude and magnificence of which can easily be missed. Language alone allows us to communicate feelings and thoughts, biases, truths, half-truths, even out-and-out lies to one another with no other aid. Language alone is enough to allow us to do that. A second feature that we'll talk some about is the fact that the symbol system we use, the language we use, is arbitrarily symbolic. Language is based on an arbitrary relationship between each symbol and its referent, whether that be an abstract idea, a concrete something, a process, a relationship, or a description. The relation between a meaningful element in a language, that is a symbol, and its denotation or referent, as it will also be called, is independent of any physical resemblance between the two, if you think about it. There's nothing about dogs that requires that they be called dogs, or about cats demanding cats. In fact, with agreement, universally, we could switch those two. We could look at dogs and call them cats. We could look at cats and call them dogs. It really wouldn't matter. We cannot tell a thing's name simply by looking at it. There's nothing in the object itself, whether it's conceptual or concrete or abstract, that leads us to the meaning of a given word. The combination of sound with meaning is arbitrary. with the possible exception of onomatopoeia, which we've talked about briefly before, in which a sound suggests but is not identical with its referent. Examples would include words like hiss, as one example. Another would be meow. Although some linguists have picked up on that and argued that, in fact, if you listen to others, I remember one specific one, I don't know the actual phrase, but in Japanese, the word for meow sounds quite different from the net result that we pick up. And of course, in English, we have decided that meow is the cat. But it really isn't when you listen to the way other languages create that particular representation of a cat's verbal offerings, utterances. So in any case, let's look then at symbols specifically, because we're going to spend some time on that, and that is to say we want to define a symbol as essentially a thing that represents, refers to, stands for, or suggests something else. Excuse me. It can be used to refer to things, to ideas, to processes, to relationships, to descriptions that are not actually present. Things like, for instance, the Houston Ship Channel. We don't have that right here in the studio classroom for sure. It refers also to things that have never existed, like Oiler or Texan World Championships. We keep waiting. They still don't exist, so we can talk about them in theory. We've never seen them. Or we can even talk about things that exist in abstract form, processes or concepts like truth or rate of change. Either of those in linguistics would be an abstract, a feature that you're never actually going to see. You can talk about it, but you're never going to be able to actually point a finger at truth. Without symbolic language, we'd be limited to what we could discuss in the here and now in our immediate sensory world. Think about how tied we'd be with that. I would not be able to sit here and give the kind of description that I've just given to you as a definition of symbol, for instance, that it refers to something else, because if we didn't have symbols, all we could talk about is how warm we are, how cool the studio is, but not even weather outside. I mean, you and I know what's going on outside the door. We couldn't talk about that because we'd have to go out there, point and gesture and so forth. That's some of what language really begins to open up. Don Foss, our former provost, has a really nice quote at the beginning of a book he wrote with a colleague a number of years back, Foss and Hakes, that describes 5 or 6 of the things that language gives us that you never really even think about. But the processes that we can extract out of the abstractions that are language are amazing. So as we continue with our discussion in the distinctive properties of language, so far they've included its communicativeness and the arbitrary symbolism that is reflected. A third feature of it has to do with the fact that it's regularly structured. That is, by rules. There are rules by which we can describe it. Language is structured in such a way that only specifically patterned arrangements of its symbols have meaning. Moreover, different arrangements, sometimes of the same or similar symbols, have different meanings. This includes rules for combining sounds or letters into words, as well as rules for combining words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs, and paragraphs into discourse. Random combinations don't usually work. Okay? In essence, what we're defining here is syntax, although we'll come back and look at it in more detail a little bit later. A fourth feature we can also point out to you is the fact that language is structured at multiple levels. Okay? Language structure can be analyzed at many, many different levels. We can look at it, for instance, in terms of sounds or phonemes that we've talked a little bit about. We're going to talk some more about it today, but sounds like p and d and sh and th or th and so forth are the fundamental sounds of our language. We can also talk about it in terms of morphemes at the level of meanings, which we will get to by the end of the lecture, I hope. And that would include things like dash ly, where you can add ly to anything that makes it seem like something, literally, or accurately, as in an accurate manner, and so forth. You could do prefixes like anti, A-N-T-I, as being against whatever you want to establish it, attach it to, anti-establishment, and so forth. Anti-inflation. We seem to be that these days. We can also look at words themselves. Chuck, would as in W-O-O-D, or would as in W-O-U-L-D. I have a question for you to consider. in sentence form, which is the fourth that we'll actually look at. And that is, in sentences, I could say to you something like, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? You know the answer, of course, don't you? A woodchuck would chuck just as much wood as a woodchuck could chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood. That will be on the exam. And in essence, we have a final form, and that is paragraphs. That is, we can combine the sentences when they deal with the same general issue, if you're doing it correctly, into paragraphs. And so in essence, what we've got as another feature that we can talk about here is what's called duality of patterning. And this is a key element of the structured at multiple levels feature of language. The duality of patterning, which I'm going to mention now, is complex. We'll partially justify this now, but we'll return to it later when we re-examine this point. All languages may also be viewed as a means of relating two different areas of patterns or forms of communication. Sound and meaning are the two that I'm talking about here. What allows us to use language to communicate is that we share a mutually understood and acceptable sound system and the physical, intellectual, or social world to which the sounds relate. Essentially, what I'm suggesting is the same kind of thing that you would talk about in perception, where you look at the world of light or sound is even easier. The vibrating air molecules out in the real world are not in our head. That is, we do not have things vibrating in our head, which allows us to hear things. What happens is that those air molecules outside vibrate the drum, the eardrum, and from that point onward, it's mechanical and then converted by the cochlea into neural energy, and it's neural activity that allows us to interpret sound. There is actually nothing between your speaker and your ear other than vibrating air molecules. It's in our head that what I'm saying is converted into language. And the duality of patterning that we're talking about really is the fact that even as we add words to the language, I can find a way to express to you whatever idea I'm trying to communicate. Okay? But it's based on the duality of patterning. We have the language, which has the flexibility that we need in it to use it to communicate with one another. But that whole thing is predicated on the fact that the understanding of language is internal to us. And so that's the duality that I'm talking about. The one is the internal understanding, and the other is the mechanism that we have developed, the language, to communicate with one another. A fifth feature, and this I'm going to argue is perhaps the key element, is the productive or generative or open nature of language itself. Within the limits of language structure, language can be used to produce unique messages. The possibilities for creating new messages are virtually limitless. There's a really nice passage in Chapter 9 of the current Matlin text that we're using that describes some of the limits, and I think she's underestimated the number of words that we have actively at our disposal and passively at our disposal, and she actually balloons that into 20-word sentences and the number of 20-word sentences that we could create. And it's more than you and I have a lifetime within which to generate. That is, if you simply take all of the 20-word sentences that are legal in English, you don't have enough lifetime to produce them all. So functionally, even though mathematicians might not like the word infinite, the possibilities for you and I as functioning individuals are literally infinite. We can create any sentence we want during the course of our lifetime and never repeat ourselves, as I'll show you a little bit later here. New linguistic messages are coined freely and easily, even by youngsters as they're mastering the language. This is one of the uniquely identifying, most universal characteristics of language. We can create an infinite number of sentences. You don't think so? Consider the following. Okay? Let's take a look at the screen, and I'm going to show you something here. If you look at the first sentence there, it is Juan's favorite number is 1. The second one is Juan's favorite number is 2. No, Juan's favorite number is 3. And we can go on to the limit of numbers and never create the same sentence. So the idea that language is functionally infinite is in fact demonstrable even using the physical scientist's favorite mechanism, and that is math. It is literally an infinite process. Now, many times we say the same thing. You know, you always say hi to people and they say hi to you, and the interactions that you have with your significant other tend to be pretty stable and predictable, but you could change them up one day. and he or she would still be able to track you. But the process of generating those words is functionally infinite. Let me show you another example of what I'm talking about, and that is start with the three words boy, girl, and kiss. Okay? Combining them, we can generate one meaning by simply saying boy kisses girl, or even make it a command, boy kiss girl. We can change it around, kiss boy, girl, or boy, girl, kiss, if we're just describing it from a distance. But we can reverse those words in each case, and we've got three more units. Okay? I can't read it. I'm going to have to change and stop using that red. So that's got to be girl kisses boy. Kiss girl, boy, or girl, boy, kiss. So you've used three words, and you've got 6 different meanings out of that. That is core. That's a demonstration of the productivity of the language that we have, and I'm going to argue that that is perhaps the keyest, the most key feature of all the different elements of language, the idea that it is productive, that is, that you can use a set number of terms in basically any way that you'd like to do so. In fact, let me give you another example. If I describe an animal to you that is horse-like, it tends to have black skin with white stripes on it, or white skin with black stripes on it, depending on your preference. It tends to have a short mane and a relatively thin tail. What I have done is describe for you a zebra. And in fact, you could then go onto the plains of Africa and point out an animal and say with confidence, that's a zebra, even though you'd never seen one before. So one of the other benefits, one of the other productive elements of language is built into the fact that you can use words to create other words. And we're constantly doing that, and we agree on it enough so that we can actually publish Webster's International Dictionary or the Oxford International, both of which are simply list upon list upon list of words. And in fact, they use words to combine and define other words. That was very frustrating for me in 5th grade when I got into the circle of not being able to understand one of the words used in the definition. So I went to look up that, and that gave me some other words that I didn't understand. So I looked up those, and that gave me other words. And I was just in a vicious circle until I eventually got back around to the word that I'd originally been trying to look up. And it kind of left me a little nonplussed by the entire activity. But a dictionary is basically a hardcore demonstration of the fact that you and I agree on the key elements of the language that we speak in this situation. So we're using there the principle of combination when we use boy, girl, and kiss as an example. The other thing that I would share with you there is the fact that if you do the math on it, 3 terms gives you 3 terms gives you 6 possibilities. 4 terms gives you, I'm going to make a guess here, and I think I'm wrong, but I think it's 9. And it goes up geometrically. That is, as you add one additional word to the length of the sentence, you can combine those in different ways and generate unique sentences in excess of the number of words that you're actually adding up. So it goes up essentially as the square less the number of words that you've actually used. So the various sounds and letters of English can be combined endlessly to form new words and new sentences. Example of new words that I would point out to you during my time, early in my life when the first astronaut was launched, NASA needed a way to, I'm off track here, but it's interesting. One of the things that they did in designing that, a human factors process, was that they had all the needles so that they were flat. That is, when the oxygen ratio was in the proper balance, when everything was correct on any of whatever gauge was being measured, the needle was flat. And so the idea is that you can scan very quickly across gauges that are all flat without reading what they are. And if one of them happens to be a Kimber, you can immediately focus on that gauge. But the phrase that was developed by the astronauts to describe when everything was flat, that is okay, was A-OK. It actually traces back to the initial communication between the astronauts and home base here in Houston. Another one that has come up during your lifetime is 24/7. That is a phrase that, you say of a store, it's open 24/7, and you've told somebody you can go in any time. And you don't have to say all that, or it's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is a very wordy way to say it's open 24/7. So that's a word that has been added to our vocabulary just in the course of, certainly, of your lifetime. And those are all examples of what makes our language as productive as it actually is. So language is endlessly, inherently creative, because none of us will ever hear all the sentences that could be created. or all that we ourselves are capable of producing. It's simply built into the productivity of the language itself. And then we have a final feature to add for you, and that is the dynamic nature. Languages evolve constantly. They're constantly changing. Teens, interestingly enough, are the first age group to make contributions. And now that we've got cell phones, there is a whole other language that has developed. It includes spelling errors, which are permissible. I started as an academic firing back when I got the first things with CU as letters in the thing when it was important to the message, just saying, when you write to me in standard English, I'll respond. In the meantime, you're in college and you need to learn to speak the language, not realizing that it was all being done by cell phone. So I've been hammered into submission. So I now respond to telephone messages. But that's an example of where the nature of the device itself, with those dinky little buttons. I'd love to have a wristwatch about 4 inches wide so that my hand could hit all the buttons there. But that's necessitated shortening the language, simply so that you get some semblance of the accuracy of whatever message someone is trying to send to you. William Shakespeare is said to have actually invented over 1,700 words, representing at that time about 8.5% of his total written vocabulary, simply by combining parts of other words to form new words in countless ways, including, interestingly enough, the word countless. So Shakespeare has been a major producer of words during the course of his lifetime. That's from a book by Lederer in 1991 that I've rather enjoyed. And so basically, if we put all 6 of them up, I can share with you the topics that we've been talking about here. That when we talk about the distinctive properties of language, we're talking about it being communicative, being arbitrarily symbolic, regularly structured at multiple levels, productive, which I would argue is the key feature, and dynamic, that is constantly changing. So at this point, what we're going to do now is to look at trying to actually describe the language. And we're going to do it based on what is called linguistic relativity. In studying memory, you may have noticed that we talked about memory's content, we talked about the way in which it was structured, and even the operating processes, including coding, retrieval, and the various transformations that memory can visit upon us. We can do the same thing with language, as some psycholinguists have done, but the levels are more substantive, that is, more numerous, and complexities are much increased when we deal with language as opposed to the storage of language. So linguistic analysis ranges from fundamental components, which we'll review here, to compound components, to very complex components. Sound is simple. Meaning, on the other hand, is quite complex. In fact, if you read in the literature, psychologists do not have a fully satisfactory definition of meaningfulness. We know what it is, but how do you measure it? How do you document meaningfulness? You can look at associations. How many words does a word make you think of? You can look at its imagery. It's just, the list is almost endless of the different ways in which the frequency with which a word occurs. Is that related to meaningfulness? Well, all of those things fold into the ultimate definition of meaning. And meaning is one of the key elements of language, as we saw a little earlier with boy, girl, and kiss, where the same words, organized in a different order, convey a different meaning. And I will also show you a little bit later some examples of where stress can also completely change what is talked about. In the, what is communicated in a given sentence. So if we start here with some specific examples of the kind of pieces of language that we're dealing with here, one of them is phonemes. Basically, what we're talking about here is that there are 26 letters in English, but they vary tremendously in frequency. If you think about it, R, S, T, L, and E are very high frequency letters. And in fact, if you've ever watched Wheel of Fortune, the T's that they give the winner of the program during the day are those 5 letters, basically because those are the most high-frequency letters in our language. But if you think about it a minute, if you've ever listened to that program, what are the most commonly used letters that are guessed in addition? Because if they give you 5 letters as a throwaway at the beginning, you can add 3 more and be up to 8, which is essentially a third of the language, particularly when you throw away the very low-frequency letters like J and Q and Z, which have a very low sequence of appearance. And the result is that candidates or contestants there never throw in those 3 letters simply because they're very low frequency. But if you think about it, the main ones that are added are C, D, M, and A. A is the second most frequent vowel. And 99% of the time, I should do a study of that at some point, because when I have throwaway time, I'll watch Wheel of Fortune. It must be true. It must be confessed. It's a total waste. I acknowledge it, but at least I acknowledge it publicly. But in any case, those C, D, M, and A are the letters that are most frequently guessed. Sometimes they'll throw in an H or something like that. But C, D, M, and A are probably the highest frequency guessed words that are letters that are also used in there. But similarly, in addition to phonemes, we also have over 100 phones, which we're going to describe simply or define as simply the smallest distinguishable unit of all possible human speech sounds. Okay? No one language uses all of them. Some use as many as 85, and one advantage of that for the language is that the words can be very short. Okay, because you have such a high variety of letters or sounds available to you, so it doesn't take a stringing together of many phones before you have a unique identifier for the many different things that we have to identify. On the other hand, there are a few languages, there is one language at least, that uses as few as 15 phones and tend to have very long words, and what I'm thinking of there is Hawaiian. And if you've ever been on Oahu or any of the Hawaiian Islands, you will know that the street names tend to string out to 12 or 15 letters sometimes. Areas of town, 12 to 15 letters. They do follow the normal, what's called Zipf's law, Z-I-P-F. Never been able to pronounce that properly. But what Zipf's law tells you is that the more frequently a word is used, the shorter it tends to be. Okay? So when you use a word, a good example is television, which started out as television, but then it was shortened to the telly, and then we shortened it eventually to the. And that often is used. The compromise has been ultimately to normally refer to it as TV. But that word initially started out as television, and then went through the zip process as it was gradually shortened, as it kind of took over our life. And so in essence, English, where Hawaiian has only 15 phoneme sounds on which it can be based, the net result is, in order to have unique identifiers for the same number of concepts that we have to identify in English, or a language that has 85, almost twice as many as sounds as we have, with fewer sounds, you have to have longer words. With more sounds, you can have shorter words. But we are still guilty of longer words like convenient, or intelligible, or intelligibility, if you really want to add on to it. And you can go on anti-intelligibility, and we could go phenomenally long on that. But in essence then, let's define a second more important term, and the one more frequently used here, and that is phoneme, which is essentially the basic speech unit of a spoken language, which can be distinguished by how it is produced. And by that, what I mean is how it's voiced, whether it's unvoiced or plosive or fricative. And I'll show you examples of each of those in a few minutes. The reason for the difference between phone and phoneme is the fact that if you think of, Matlin has a really great illustration within her chapter 9 related to EA and the different ways in which that sequence of letters can be pronounced. And she demonstrated, I think, 12 or 16 different pronunciations, if I remember the example correctly, in there. And that's the reason we have the phonemes. That is, they are a given sound. Can be sounded very differently, or U is sounded very differently in cough, where it basically isn't even there, to something like up or cup. But in fact, the way in which the U sound is pronounced in up is different from the way in which the U sound is pronounced in cup. That is, the phoneme that precedes a given sound alters because the mouth is shaped differently, and it's moving to the shape for the sound that you're going to produce. And how that moves alters the actual basic sound. So phonemes are kind of the smallest element that you would regularly identify as a particular fundamental sound of a particular language. Let's give you some examples of what we're talking about here. And that is, first of all, we have the vowels. And those are basically A, E, I, O, and U. In some words, Y would also be included. Now you're asking why? Well, there's the answer. W-H-Y doesn't have any other vowel-like sound, and you need the vowel sounds in order to separate the consonants. because shifting from one to another consonant is sometimes kind of awkward. That's one of the reasons that we don't have QZ in our language. That's just not a legal letter combination, and you'll almost never see it. Even in quiz, we separate it by a U and an I. So in any case, the vowels, if you think about them, well, I think I'm going to get back to those in a minute, so I'll hold off on the comments that I have here. But the others, of course, are the consonants. And there are quite a number of those if you look at them. And as you can appreciate, some of those can be pronounced in a number of different ways. But in fact, those are the basic units of which our phonemes are constituted. And any given vowel may be used or pronounced in several different ways, depending on the nature of the word within which that phoneme or vowel is buried, and consonant for that matter. So in essence, what we're going to do then is to define phonemics as the study, whoops, I went too far there, too many button pushes, as the study of the particular phonemes of a language. So if you're studying phonemes, you are engaged in phonemics. And a follow-up then has to do with phonetics, which we can define essentially as, and this was too long to get on the screen, so I had to alter it a little, the study of how to produce or combine speech sound or to represent them with written symbols. So that's making another leap from spoken language into various ways in which it can be illustrated. And in fact, I've already shared this with you, so I won't burden you with a whole lot of description of it here. But this just shows you on the left an example of some of the fundamental units that are used when you're presenting something phonemically. That is, you're writing out the language in terms of the sounds. So someone who doesn't speak English could nonetheless pronounce my name, Richard A. Cashaw. You'll notice that the insignia in IPA is E for the sound A. Okay, so the phoneme A is actually signed in IPA by the E symbol. And so in essence, each phoneme is represented by a single symbol, and it's produced by a complex combination, and it is really complex, of our lungs, the vocal cavity, our larynx, our lips, our tongue, and even for that matter, our teeth in certain combinations. So the vocal cords are key to this, and they are basically two membranes that are stretched very tightly across our throat. And they vibrate due to the passage of air going up the windpipe or throat, depending on how tightly we stretch them. The difference between a scream and a very low voice is going to have a very different amount of stress on your windpipes and on your vocal cords in producing that. But the net result then is sounds. And in fact, the vocal cord sounds that we produce are the vowels, A, E, I, O, U, and maybe some pronunciation, some forms of Y. But if you think about it for a minute, pronounce each of those vowels to yourself, A, E, I, O, and U. And if you feel what you're doing there, your mouth doesn't get in the way at all. It does shape it. A, E, I, O, and U are all open throat sounds. The only thing that makes the difference there is the vibration of the vocal cords and the particular shape that your mouth is held in, but they're all open. That is, they're aerated, they're breathy, and the mouth gets entirely out of the way, and it simply shapes it becomes an echo chamber for each of the different vowels. So those are open-throated vocal cord sounds. On the other hand, if you look at the consonants that are involved, those can be produced in a number of different ways. For instance, F and V are what are called labial sounds. That is, they are produced predominantly by the shape of our lips, what our lips are doing as we vocalize F or V. I've talked before about the plosive sounds. In each case here, you block the air very briefly and release it. So your lips come to close and then produce literally an explosion of air. It's just a puff, but in fact, P. You can't hold the letter P or any of the ones that are listed there, D, K, P, and F. D. You can't do it because it's actually the release of that fluff of air that produces the sound for you. Then we've also got nasal sounds, and those are M and N, and N. That's the only time you actually use your nasal cavity, I should say. Your nasal cavity is what produces the difference between and N. Also, the shape of your tongue in blocking the airflow as you're humming, as it echoes through the nasal chamber. And we've also got what I've also talked about before, and that is the voiced versus non-voiced effect. So that F and Z, and there's another one that you won't be able to see on the screen there. I'll back up just a second to show you what I was talking about. And that is F and V, the mouth is held exactly the same. Those are labial sounds. S and Z are not labial sounds, but both of those letter pairs share voicing or non-voicing in common. That is, S, think about it, feel your vocal cords, and when you hold your mouth to say S, it is exactly the way you hold your mouth when you say Z. The only difference is your vocal cords are vibrating in Z. That is, Z is vocalized. You can feel your vocal cords vibrating. And with F and V, your mouth and lips are shaped the same. The difference is that the vocal cords are vibrating in V when pronouncing V. So in essence, we use our lips for some elements. We use the vocal cords for other elements in combination with the lips, the nasal chambers, and voicing or non-voicing. All of those are factors that allow us to produce the 45 or so phonemes that we actually produce. One that we do not produce is a click. I can't even mimic that, but in some of the languages among natives in Africa, there is a click, an actual that is part of the spoken language, and it's considered to be a pronunciation feature of the language, and it's integrated right into the spelling and thus the pronunciation of those terms. It seems unusual to us only because it's such an unusual use of the mouth, but it's still a mouth-produced sound that is generated in that case. Robert Sternberg, for instance, suggests a very interesting test of some of the elements that I was talking about. Place your hand 1 inch in front of your mouth, okay? And then pronounce the following sentence. Just hold your hand about 1 inch in front of your mouth while you say, put the paper cup to your lip, and feel what your hand or what your fingers are experiencing. Can you feel the difference? Because you've got a whole bunch of P's in there, but there's actually a lot of difference in the phonemes that you're actually producing. They're all P's, so you'd think they'd all be the same phoneme. Not so. And this is a very clever example of the fact that, in this case, the P's in paper are what are sometimes labeled by the PH sound. Not sometimes, they are labeled in IPA by the PH sound. And what's happening there is, if you think about it, if you feel your hand put the paper, you're feeling air. So that H sound is P, essentially. That's different from cup. I mean, I've over-accentuated that, but the P sound in the pink sounds there, pink words, I mean, cup and lip, if you feel, you're producing the P sound, but there's no air to it. It's basically just a release of the pressure, but it's not intended to have air moving across the lips when you do it, as it is with put. It's the release of air across the lips that produces that PH sound, the phoneme that is identified by PH, okay? And so again, if you use that as an example, the put the paper cup to your lip is demonstrating the PH sound as identified by IPA in the first 2 words, and the first 3 words actually, and 2 of the first 3 words. I'll get it right eventually. And then in 2 of the 4 last words, you've got a different form, still P, but pronounced very differently. The phonemic difference is built right into the language there. And that leads us into something that we've already looked at before, but I want to point out some additional features to you this time as we come back through it. And that is what spectrographs allowed us to do was basically to plot the occurrence of specific sound frequencies as a function of time. And as a result of that, what we can do is to study phonemes, quite accurately as they function in language. That is, we can measure very precisely on a timeline when a given sound starts, when it stops. We can measure frequencies, for instance, and your stereo has in it, for instance, a crossover filter as a feature of it. And what that crossover filter does is to separate out high frequency and low frequency notes. I'm jumbling my notes relative to what I'm trying to say to you here, but high and low frequency notes or frequencies are separated by a crossover filter. And what happens then is that the low frequencies are sent to the woofers, to the bass speakers, and the high frequencies are sent to the tweeters, the smallest speakers in the stereo. But essentially that same technology is what could be used to produce the spectrograph that I'm going to show you here in just a minute. And what it does is simply to analyze speech sounds as a function of time. The output from each filter is recorded on moving paper, or it can be done on a screen with a movie camera, if you'd rather, an video recorder of some sort. But what it allows is a visual analysis of speech sounds, one element. It allows the depiction of the form of specific phonemes and the production of a voice print. All of those can be done. It's an accurate way to study how acoustic properties of speech vary over time, and they do. In normal children, for instance, hearing speech serves as a model. Most of us with full hearing learn to speak by listening to mom and dad or whoever was taking care of us. Okay? Children hears his or her own speech. That's another feedback pattern. As an observation, you may not be aware of the fact that each of us hears you with a higher level voice than you think you have, which is the reason that sometimes when you hear a recording of yourself on a phone, you think to yourself, well, that's not me. I don't sound that tinny. Well, in fact, you do. That is exactly the way each of us sounds. The problem is that our ears, if you remember, we talked about the structure of the ear itself, and the cochlea is buried in a bone structure, and those bones are connected to, they're part of the same thing that supports your jaw and the ear structure, and those bones vibrate or lend a resonance to the sounds that the cochlea is feeding into the oral nerve, the nerve of hearing, in such a way that your nerve system picks up more bass than you are actually outputting. In other words, you hear differently than, I shouldn't say outputting, than it's being input into you. You hear it at a more bass level than you are actually able to produce it when you're speaking. So in essence, in deaf children, think about it. The normal kid can use that combination of skills that I talked about basically to mimic the sounds that they hear. So if they mispronounce a word, parents will normally correct it enough time so that the child learns. It isn't like, do it this way. It is a matter of the fact that when you hear a child mispronounce a word, you normally just say it back to them so that they know how to pronounce it. But you think about it, in deaf children, the feedback loop is missing. It simply isn't there. But they can shape their voices when they look at a sample such as is provided by this mechanism, that is by the spectrograph. That is, they can by speaking into a microphone, one of the ways in which a deaf child can learn to speak is by learning to produce the speech sounds that are replicated here. And the only two things that are actually presented here are, first of all, frequencies, and when are they there. So it's essentially, it's computer analyzed before it's fed onto the screen this way. But what's reflected there is the actual sound pattern to do a phrase like, to catch pink salmon. And that's what is depicted there. And you'll see that there are different frequencies that are reflected there at different time intervals. And when you tie it back to the sounds that are being produced, the ch is a kind of a flat, very short sound, actually, to catch pink salmon. Ch does not take long in the total sequence of events there. It's about, it's less than 1/10 of a second to do that, about 1/5 of a about 1/20th of a second to say that. And the interesting thing is that in the word pink salmon, or the phrase pink salmon, there's a longer pause during the process of saying pink than there is in the gap between pink as one word and salmon as the next. If you look when the frequencies are being produced, the frequencies carry over that sequence. So you and I really produce a babble of sounds. And that's one of the reasons that writing is so different from speaking. Because in fact, speaking is time sequenced, and there are tonal hints. But there's no hint as to when the gaps actually occur. I remember one time I did a word association study with 1st, 3rd, and 5th graders, and one of the words I used was once. And one of the youngsters in there gave as an association to that is we were measuring associations to a variety of nouns, verbs, adjectives. One of the words we used was once as a different kind of word, and her association to it was upona, U-P-O-N-A. And I asked her specifically, upona, because all she'd ever heard that was it was read to her once upon a time. She was young enough that she hadn't yet been reading fairy tales, and for her, apana was a word, because apana is always there, once upon a time. Okay? And so, in essence, words are not always real good about defining their limits when you're simply listening to them. But in essence, what's also reflected in that diagram then are our formants. So we're going to go back to it and show you the following kind of thing. One of the base frequencies that is always reflected here, and I've shown you all of these, so I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but I just want to point out that what's here are what are called formants, and those are the base frequencies that are present when somebody is speaking to you. Okay? I have a demonstration by Chuck Scott, who is the Saturday evening announcer on KUHT. He has one of my all-time favorite voices. If you ever get a chance during the commercial break on Prairie Home Companion at 6 p.m., Chuck is normally on doing an announcement. He has a magnificent, very low voice. It's just beautiful. He did a demonstration for me. I couldn't find it this morning because I wanted to play it for you to show you. What will happen is that the formants in that case will be compressed. So those formants actually represent three basic frequencies. Keep that picture in mind because I'm going to talk now about specifically what's depicted there. And that is if you have a low voice, all three of those formants are compressed downward. That is, they are what is called compressed formants when you have a very low Chuck Scott type voice. The upper frequency may actually be lower than the lowest frequency when you're listening to a high-voiced person, a soprano, speaking in a very high squeaky voice. And you can think of stars in Hollywood that do that. Their lowest formant may actually be above the highest formant for someone like Chuck Scott with that beautiful low voice. And in fact, then the ratio of low to high to medium remains constant. Sorry, low to medium to high. Don't want to be out of order there. But in essence, that ratio is a constant, and that's what allows us to understand one another. That is, we're not listening to particular frequencies, we are listening to that ratio of formants. That's how we're communicating with each other. And so basically, even if a very low-bass person is speaking, you can still understand him right next to a soprano. It would be fun, I think, to get the two of them into an argument with each other at some point, a bass and a soprano. But you can still understand it, even though the frequencies are almost non-overlapping. In that case, the formants are almost non-overlapping. So now let's jump to another, basically the 16 section of the lecture. We're going to try and get ahead here so that we can collapse two lectures because we dawdled some bit in memory earlier. So in any case, the next thing we're going to look at is morphemes, where we're going to define a morpheme. Essentially, it's the next larger unit of language, and that is essentially the smallest unit of single or combined sounds that denotes meaning in a language. For example, a prefix or a suffix can be combined with other morphemes to form words. Okay? So in essence, a morpheme is the units that can be combined to produce words. There is some overlap, for instance, between phonemes and morphemes. I, as an example, I is a phoneme. That is, that's a unique sound in English that is repeated many different ways, but in fact it also serves as a morpheme because in that case it communicates an individual. I'll show you some other examples of where that can mess us up here a little bit later. A second type of morpheme is what is called a content morpheme. Those are words that convey the primary meaning of a concept. It's also in some cases called a root word, and I'll give you some examples of this a little bit later in the lecture here. A second type of morpheme, I'll get this right eventually, is not let me back up a little bit, I'm ahead of myself. The content phoneme is what I just read to you or spoke to you, and that is the words that convey the primary meaning, also called the root word. Okay? The other type of morpheme that I wanted to define for you is a function morpheme. And that's the parts of a word that add detail and nuance to the primary meaning of a content morpheme. So those are things that may, and I'll show you examples of this a little bit later, but basically it's the parts of a word that help the content morpheme to fit the grammatical context. For instance, the prefix, such as anti, or the suffix such as ly, even the article such as the or the conjunction word and. And the are examples of words that alter the meaning. One of the demonstrations in Matlin's text was a very clever study done by, I forget the man's name that did it, but it was essentially 10 sentences that said exactly the same thing to us, but in one case each sentence started with a, and in the other case the. And it turns out you get a very different level of brain activity in the frontal and parietal lobes, depending on which you're using, because a is generic, a woman, a man, a this, a that, but the woman, the man identifies a particular individual. And so even words like a and the and conjunctions like and can alter the meaning of the base words that you're trying to use there, the root words. So morphemes can be composed in some cases of words. They can be composed of word parts or prefixes or suffixes, or any combination of those may be strung together to create a particular kind of effect. The other word that is relevant here is the concept of inflections. And basically with inflection, what we're dealing with here is common suffixes that we add to words in order to fit the grammatical context. Okay? Consider the following sentence as an example, and that is, the young psychologist hated wistful paintings. Kind of a goofy sentence. But in essence, what's being demonstrated there is the idea that different parts of the sentence are composed of different types of morphemes. So if you look at it, the young are basically just function morphemes. Okay, the and young. The combination of free and bound or content morphemes is represented by the rest of the sentence there. Okay, those are content words like psychologist, an element of content, hated, which is his particular emotional state, wistful, which is a type of, paintings, which is the direct object. Okay, so the last four of those words are basically content morphemes as we've defined them. The first two are simply function morphemes. And so in essence, we can look at it this way, another way to diagram this. And that is, psychologist has a base word, and then there is a modifying morpheme added to it. Ist as opposed to psychology, which would be the fundamental discipline and so forth. But ist is what's been added there to let us know that we're talking about the individual in that case. Hate is the base word, and in this case we've added past tense, hated. Wistful is wist, defined simply as a state, okay, wistful. And finally then paintings are painting plus S. Now that might occur to you, given that, to raise the following issue. Well, why isn't that actually three morphemes? Why is paintings not converted into three morphemes? And there turns out to be a very good reason if you think about it a second. And that is the fact that paintings is actually only two morphemes because it's talking about a particular type of art, not a statue, but a painting. And that's what's being pluralized. Because paint, yes, is a base word. And we can add to it ing, as in painting, and we can add to that s to pluralize it. But in fact, that's not a legitimate use in this particular sentence. Okay? You might be able to construe a situation where you would be talking about various kinds of painting as an activity, and several of them where you would actually use paintings, as in, for instance, if you've done a room vertically versus horizontally when you're stroking it, that might be different types of paintings, in which case that would be a legitimate breakdown. But it's not in this instance because we're referring to a painting. So morphemes are subtle. That is, you have to spend some time with them to really begin to understand what's going on with them. And in essence then, what we're really building toward here is a lexicon, which is basically, darn it, I keep hitting the button too many times for you today. So in essence, a lexicon is essentially the entire set of morphemes in a given language, or the entire set of morphemes in a particular person's active and passive memory. You can define that either individually or collectively for all of us, either way. The average adult has perhaps 80,000 morphemes. That's an overestimate relative to what Matlin is talking about. I'm going to have to write her a note at some point and challenge her use of the figures or find the references that she used, but can combine them to produce a vocabulary of hundreds of thousands of different morphemes. You and I have a huge array of morphemes available to us and ways to combine them in order to generate new words for our particular whatever meaning we are trying to communicate to people in our particular communication. So in essence, if we look at suffixes, we can take a basic word like a root word like student, and we can add a lot, let me back up. We can start with a base word, a root word like study, and we can add a variety of different morphemes to it, like ENT to produce student. We can add, for instance, IOUS to produce studious, which is a particular form of paying attention or learning stuff. We can add IED to produce studied. We can even add ING to talk about the act of studying, or for that matter, we could even pluralize it, as in studies, kind of collective activity that you engage in this course, plus the math you're in, the other psychology course, and so forth and so on, referencing your studies. And yet this production is tightly governed by rules determining how morphemes can or cannot be formed. That is, although yes, it's quite easy to wave your hand and add a particular suffix here to change the meaning of the base word, there are still very specific rules about what you can add, the spelling that has to be involved, and the pronunciation that is implied in doing each of these. Note here that the syllable cannot start with any syllable in a word cannot start with more than 3 consonants. I defy you to come up with a word that starts with more than 3 consonants. About the closest you'll get is syzygy, S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y. But there we're going to claim the Y is in fact not a consonant but a noun in that instance. But in essence, in the next level of analysis that we switch to in the studying of linguistic structure, what we're going to be looking at now is basically syntax. Okay, and we're going to define it essentially. This is not something that government collects. It's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is the pattern or patterns by which users of a particular language put words together at the level of the sentence. That is, when they're creating sentences, syntax becomes important. That's the rule system that governs combining morphemes into longer communication units. The rules that also, another thing that can be referred to here is, I keep forgetting to give you the definitions today. Okay, so again, syntax is the pattern or patterns by which users of a particular language put words together at the level of the sentence. You can also refer to it as the rules which govern the combination of morphemes into larger linguistic units, namely phrases or sentences. Okay, syntax focuses on the study of the grammar of phrases and sentences. And I have a kind of an interesting parallel to show you, because what we're doing here is moving directly into the realm of a psycholinguist. So the question is, what does a psycholinguist do? And the answer is that basically, if you think about paleontology, what a paleontologist does is to start with the bones and uses knowledge of things like muscle structure and function, the ratio of muscle size to task to be performed. He also uses, secondly, things like hair distribution and function. What's the purpose of hair in any given area? And thirdly, skin structure and function to create an image of an organism that we humans never saw, and that is saber-toothed tigers. Saber-toothed tigers were already extinct when the first form close to humans arrived on the face of the earth, and yet we have an image of what saber-toothed tigers most likely look like. There's no way to confirm it. But in essence, using what we do know about animals, bone structure and so forth, we can project what a saber-toothed tiger likely looked like. Not the kind of thing you'd want to meet on your average walk through the jungle. But if you think about it, what the paleontologist does is to start with the structure and move toward the element, the finished product, whereas a psycholinguist actually starts with the finished structure, that is the uttered sentence, and uses, first of all, knowledge of language structure, number one, secondly, rules of grammar and syntax, and third, semantics and phonology to describe the cognitive mechanism that could generate the completed sentence. So a paleontologist basically does the opposite, a psycholinguist basically does the opposite of what a paleontologist does. That's equal either way, so I didn't have to correct myself in that instance. A paleontologist does the opposite of what a psycholinguist does, and the reverse is also true. But essentially, the psycholinguist starts with the elements, with the finished product, and tries to use that to understand what the mechanism was that generated it. We're moving toward doing something that you used to do in high school and even junior high and hated it. Remember parsing sentences? That's exactly what psycholinguists do. But they're doing it for a very different reason, as we'll show you here. And that is, one of the terms we're working with is prescriptive grammar, which is basically the, quotes, correct way to structure written and spoken language. That's what English teachers were trying to teach to us so that we could communicate with each other effectively. That is, in terms of, quotes, correct English. English produced by the rules, that is, according to the rules of the language. On the other hand, what a psycholinguist is working with is what is referred to as descriptive grammar. And that we define, darn it, I keep getting too eager with my finger here today. Okay? Descriptive grammar is basically the analysis of the structure, functions, and relationships of words in public or performed language. Okay? It can be in print, it can be anywhere. But in essence, the difference there is that's what psycholinguists work with, in contrast to the previous definition. So what your English teacher was conveying to you is the rules by which English is produced, given the most commonly accepted element of that. One of the ones that drives me crazy is the fact that I had an extraordinarily gifted, good English teacher, 3 years, 10th, 11th, and 12th, and it was drilled into my very thick skull that you do not split infinitives to functionally whatever, okay? And so to this day, where it is now permissible to split infinitives, I still correct students by putting the S sign, lifting the infruiting thing between two and whatever back to the outer position. It's my hang-up. But in any case, that's a problem where prescriptive grammar has hung on into the descriptive grammar, which is much closer to what you and I are actually speaking to one another here today. So in essence then, differentiating between the two, Steven Pinker in 1984 provided this example, and I love this example. See if you can figure this sentence out. Papa, what did you bring that book that I don't want to be read to out of up for? Got to think about that a minute. Papa, what did you bring that book that I don't want to be read to out of up for? What's happened there is that the prepositions have all been jammed at the end of the sentence, and therefore you have several phrases that could be ended by, what did you bring up that book? I can't even begin to straighten it all out because I don't have a print copy to look at. But in essence, the point there is that that's a case where the rules have rigidly been followed, but they have not been followed in terms of descriptive grammar. That is, you and I would never hear somebody make a sentence like that. It just wouldn't happen. If we got into a sentence that far, what typically would happen is we'd stop, we'd interrupt ourselves. You'll occasionally hear somebody say, I've lost track of what I'm trying to say, or I lost track of myself, or what I'm trying to say is, and then they'll put things back in a more reasonable order in that kind of case. So the analysis of syntax has basically been extended to include the manner in which sentences may be transformed from one form to another. Okay? And that analysis basically shows that we humans have an amazing understanding, a remarkable understanding of syntax. To wit, for instance, we can easily identify grammatically correct and incorrect sentences. Is it grammatically correct to say to you, colorless green ideas sleep furiously? Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And the answer is yes. The right type of word is in the right position for a fundamental declarative sentence in that. That's an example proposed by Noam Chomsky years ago. But in fact, it does show the differentiation between the specific words you're using and trying to communicate and the rules that you're using. Okay? Or the other one comes from Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. 'Twas brillig and the slithy tove and did gyre and gimble in the wabe. And in fact, structurally, that sentence makes perfect sense. The words you'd need to have defined for you, but it's a perfectly good structure of English in that case. And it's really coming back to the rules that we use in terms of producing descriptive grammar. We also show syntactic priming that I've talked about a little bit here, but this is a relevant point at which to reintroduce that concept, and that is a greater inclination to use passive sentences if we've just heard others using passive sentences. This effect goes further. For instance, we tend to speak in level of sophistication at the level to which we are spoken, first of all, and we tend to mimic one another as a second element. That is, if you're out walking today here on campus, or wherever you are after you finish viewing the lecture here, the program, notice that people tend to greet you as you greet them. Try a different greeting. When you're walking past people, say hi to one person, good afternoon, or whatever, to another. And you'll find that more often than not, they parrot back to you. Simply because, assuming you're social, they also want to be social. You and I wish to appear social to one another. And it's easiest not to process into a fancy alternative or playing off it, but rather simply repeat. I have a line that I use sometimes, and it's inappropriate. I do it for my own joy if I've been having a good day. But if someone says to me, good morning, my retort in that case will be, so far, yes. And it stops a conversation because there's no comeback to that. If I had said good morning back, then we could have said, how are you, or anything like that. But I just, every now and then, for my own joy, I just say, so far, yes. But that's not mimicking as we should. Another thing related to language use in that case, the production of language, is that if you notice, I wouldn't stand in front of a 4-year-old and talk at the rate that I am to you, or secondly, at the level of complexity that I am. You and I talk down to any given person, and we can do that already by age 3 or 4. That is, a 4 or 5-year-old with a full command of 100 words will talk slower and more simplistically to a 3 or a 2-year-old they're trying to instruct. Okay, we actually are phenomenally good at adjusting to the apparent abilities of the person that we're interacting with. And then we have a third element also to show you, and that has to do with the fact that even our speech errors seem processed to assure proper syntax. This one is tricky, but it tells us a lot. And that is, we might say the fruits are in the banana basket, when we meant to say the bananas are in the fruit basket. But you would not hear us say the fruit are in the bananas basket. That is, the error we made is a several word gap of words being switched inappropriately. But the word class, plurality, is still preserved correctly. That is, in the mispronunciation, we say the fruits are, not the fruit are, even though fruit is the word that's actually been swapped. The fruit, the bananas are in the fruit basket, which is the way we're using it. So there's a separate breakdown in rules at a couple of different levels in that example. And apparently processing of syntax, pretty clearly what's demonstrated there is that the processing of syntax is separate from the processing of meanings of words. The area of study was initiated by Noam Chomsky's proposal of a universal theory of grammar. And basically, what linguists have focused on here are two different specific elements of the way in which we generate grammar. One has to do with basic productivity. As we've discussed it has to do with the functionally infinite number of sentences any of us is capable of generating, and then also the regularity with which language is produced. It refers to the universal consistency of the manner in which sentences of a specific type are generated, which leads directly into phrase structure grammar. And we won't get through all of this, but we'll launch as far as we can here today while you're with me. We're going to define phrase structure grammar as essentially the rules that govern language regularity. Okay? Sentence construction or structure often is analyzed using tree diagrams to reveal the interrelationships of syntactic classes. That's the parsing that I was talking about before. The difference here is that the diagramming now is being done consistent with, in fact, often to discover the phrase structure of the sentence. It basically reveals that sentences are not equal strings. They're not strings, but rather they're clusters of substructures of words that are organized within the structure of the sentence itself. So to create a tree diagram for a sentence, we need a set of rules. And in order to generate those rules, I'm going to show you the following list. And that is, the tree diagrams that we will use include things such as the following components. These are the components of which a phrase structure rule system is generated. Okay? One of them has to do with a component called a subject. A subject can be a noun, it can be a pronoun, it can be a noun phrase, which is what NP stands for. The predicate can be a verb or a verb phrase, either one. She ran is a complete sentence. It's a pronoun and a verb. That's all you need. A noun phrase, you can stack words together to generate longer sentences. So this structure is used to generate longer, more complex sentences. That can be a determiner like a, an, or the, and a noun. Verb phrase can be a verb plus a noun phrase. And already you can see the compounding that is possible as we start stacking the rules on top of each other. A determiner can be words like a, an, or the. There are others, but those are the key ones that tend to be used. Nouns, that's the whole dictionary basically. Dog, cat, apple, orange, you name it. Verbs, see, walk, go, the action words, and there's a long list of those too. So in essence then, we string them together with the following kind of rules. And that is we can look at, for instance, sentence equals noun phrase plus a verb phrase, or S equals NP plus VP in the rule system we were talking about a minute ago. We can do noun phrase equals determiner plus noun. We can spread this out. Verb phrase equals verb plus prepositional phrase. Verb phrase equals verb plus noun phrase. A lot of different ways in which to do this, okay? And I'll simply lay out the rest of these, and that'll represent a good stopping point for us today, where the prepositional phrase equals the preposition plus a noun phrase. We'll show you a specific example next time in terms of diagramming sentences.